This is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. What would a second Trump term mean for K-12 and higher education in this country? And conversely, what might a Biden presidency mean for students and schools? These are big questions, and to help break down the answers, I have two guests joining us today. Michael Stratford covers higher education for Politico Pro. Michael, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
And Lauren Camera is also with us. She covers education for U.S. News and World Report. Lauren, welcome back to EWA Radio.
Thanks for having me, Emily.
Lauren, I do want to start with K-12, so let's jump right in, and then we'll turn back to Michael for post-secondary education. It's arguable that Trump's impact on K-12 has been most seismic the past 6 months, not because of a specific regulation, but because of how his administration has handled the COVID-19 pandemic. Let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I really can't agree with that assessment enough. You have an administration that is pressuring schools to reopen for in-person learning, even going so far, for example, as to say, we will withhold funding from you unless you do so. But at the same time, not really creating the public health conditions that would allow a lot of schools to reopen, especially those in communities with high infection rates. As you know, CDC guidance has been slow. It's been messy. It's been pretty lacking until very recently. Yesterday, DeVos said very directly that it's not her responsibility to create a database to track schools or their infection rates or their reopening plans, even though that's exactly what school leaders have been begging them to do, more or less. And as it stands now, schools are begging for another round of federal relief. And Congress and the White House is just not looking like they're going to get that done. So it's really created quite a chaotic situation. And I think this is this is like very personal for voters as they go in the coming weeks to election days. This is definitely top of mind.
Has he had any support that he had before from any educator groups, organizations, or even just folks who follow public schools that has eroded as a result of his handling of the pandemic? Have you seen any shift there?
Well, I wouldn't say he's made a lot of new friends necessarily. Of course, he's started off a foe of the teachers union, and that certainly has become only more toxic in that relationship. I think his relationship with the charter school sector is messy and complicated. On one hand, it's school choice. On the other hand, a lot of the civil rights and racial inequity issues that charter schools are all about are also at odds with a lot of the administration's policies. So that's a little bit difficult for them. I think probably the only education groups he's maintained as a good friend are those that support, private school choice, groups like the American Federation for Children, which of course Secretary DeVos used to head.
Well, his biggest plank in the 2016 election was, in terms of education policy, was certainly school choice. What has actually been accomplished on that front in 4 years?
Well, from a federal level, they've fallen well short of what they've hoped to accomplish. And they haven't been able to make any headway on the big tax credit scholarship program, for example, or various portability proposals that would allow Title I or IDEA funds to follow students. I think one of their biggest wins is the recent Supreme Court ruling that invalidated some of the Blaine amendments that states have. And that was really one of their biggest wins. It essentially said, states with private school choice programs, so like private school vouchers or tax credit scholarships, they have to allow those dollars to also fund tuition at parochial schools if that's what the families want to choose to do. So that was a pretty big win for them. They've expanded the DC Opportunity Scholarship. But I think, the most influence has simply been from the bully pulpit. I mean, DeVos traveling to places like Florida, Arizona, Michigan, Florida, sort of to spotlight all the various private school choice programs. There's definitely been an uptick in state level legislation on that front.
One of the things that's new on his platform, and it actually came out very recently, and that is that he's calling for a federal initiative on patriotic education. And a lot of people see this as a response to the New York Times 1619 project. How likely is that at a federal level?
I would say not likely at all. I mean, even Republicans admit this. I mean, we remember very well the entire rejection of the Common Core state standards from a lot of GOP members. Well, this is sort of exactly what they're turning around and trying to do. And as a lot of different reporters have noted, there's a specific section of the Every Student Succeeds Act that prohibits federal intrusion into curriculum. So I would be very surprised if this ends up seeing the light of day.
Is there anything new or unusual on his K-12 platform?
Not really. This is basic conservative sweet spots. Big focus is still on school choice, and I've actually been pretty surprised at how prominent that's played during the campaign. You hear Trump talk about it, you hear Pence talk about it much more than they have over the last 4 years of their tenure. So that's really what they've been focusing on.
Let's take a sharp left turn, if you will, and now talk about Vice President Joe Biden's campaign. Let's start with what he says he would have done differently in terms of schools and handling the pandemic.
Well, I think the one thing he's been clearest about is that he would have handled the pandemic differently from a public health perspective. And that in itself would have laid the groundwork for schools to be able to adjust or reopen or move to an online setting much easier. He hasn't really necessarily focused on what he would have done for schools differently other than continuing to press Congress and the White House to fund education more, give them the resources that they need to be able to do some of these really difficult things. But his stance more comes from this public health for the country, saying, well, I would have put a mask mandate in place, for example, and that could have cut infection rates significantly. Things like that would have laid out a better landscape for schools to be able to be more effective in how they react to the virus.
One of the things that Biden has said he wants to do is to triple Title I funding for poor schools. I'm curious, could that even happen if the Democrats don't take back the Senate?
I'd say he could probably get a fair amount of additional funding for Title I. It's typically been a bipartisan issue. You've seen some pretty decent increases the last few years, even under the Trump administration. I doubt he'd be able to triple it, but I would imagine he'd be able to push through some significant increases for both Title I and IDEA.
He also wants to raise teacher pay, add mental health programs and staff, and fix school infrastructure. Certainly, school infrastructure, I know, has been something that has had in the past bipartisan support. What's taking so long?
Yeah, infrastructure is a great example of a bipartisan area where both sides would like to get something done. Of course, as you mentioned, that's gone back a while now. They've been saying this for years under both the Obama administration and the Trump administration. When it comes to school infrastructure, schools are typically left off the infrastructure to-do list because it's seen as a local responsibility, as a state and a local responsibility. So it's been very rare that federal funding is made available for infrastructure for schools. But I think the pandemic is laying bare, at least one thing it's laying bare, is the state of school disrepair. A lot of schools with HVAC issues, windows that don't open, and clearly there's appetite on both sides of the aisle to fix this. I think that there's probably also a lot of bipartisan recognition, especially after the pandemic, that students will have some pretty hefty mental health issues to work out. This hasn't been easy, especially for some of the most vulnerable students we have. And so I wouldn't be surprised if you see some partnering across the aisle there as well.
Well, I would also argue that the pandemic has made it clear, if it wasn't clear to people already, that our child care safety net is basically Swiss cheese. And Biden has proposed a massive investment in early childhood education, including universal preschool and financial help and incentives for both child care centers and child care workers. Again, a lot of that dates back to the Obama administration, and people are still waiting. Is there a different attitude or sense among federal policymakers now about the role of childcare?
So I think it's always been a pretty bipartisan issue, but what has changed in terms of increasing the urgency for this is the pandemic itself. And if I'm being really frank, what's changed is middle and upper class white families suddenly without childcare options who can't throw money at a problem to make it go away. They're sort of finally understanding how frail the childcare system has been, even though it's been that way, as you put it, Swiss cheese for decades. And, it really is just one of those bipartisan issues. You see Democrats and Republicans both trying to figure this out. In fact, we've already seen some of that collaboration in both chambers with members of both parties already collaborating and pushing out some proposals. So I would bet on that one happening.
Let me ask you the same thing I asked you about Trump's platform, and that is there anything unusual or surprising in the education plan? Or again, on the K-12 side, are you looking at, as you called it, some Democratic sweet spots?
Yeah, so I don't know if there's necessarily anything really surprising, but there's a couple things that I'm very interested in seeing how they play out. One, with charter schools, I don't think we're going to see this huge backlash to charter schools like a lot of people are thinking we might. And you got to remember that under the Obama Biden administration, the number of charter schools, the number of students attending charter schools increased more than it ever has in the entirety of charter schools existing in that time frame. So that's one thing. The second thing is, even before the country began this really intense moment of reckoning over racial inequality, Biden has, had multiple times, both on the campaign trail and even during one or two of the primary debates, cited that Ed Built's $23 billion figure, that majority white school districts receive $23 billion more than school districts where Black and Hispanic students are the majority. This is a really, really difficult problem to solve. And I don't know how much leverage the federal government has here, but I wouldn't be surprised to see Biden try to tackle this in some way, perhaps a partnership between Ed and HUD potentially. That's definitely one area that I'm interested in watching him on.
It's early, obviously, and certainly premature, but we've seen some leaks in the Twitter sphere that Biden is talking to some folks about potential cabinet positions. And I'm wondering, is it too soon for people to be floating names for potential secretaries of education?
Yes, but that certainly doesn't mean we won't or can't. Um,
Do it anyway,
I
Lauren.
I don't love being a prognosticator, predictor, but I am watching closely Jeffrey Canada, Johanna Hayes, Linda Darling Hammond. He's committed to choosing someone who has been a public school teacher. So that actually surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, depending on where you live, X's out a lot of the usual Washingtonian sort of policymakers that you think of as having a big influence on K-12 education. So we'll see. We'll see what happens.
I got two more names.
Yes.
Brenda Casillas,
Mm-hmm.
currently superintendent in Boston, former education commissioner for Minnesota, and Sonia Santelises,
Of course, of course. How could I forget?
currently superintendent of Baltimore.
Yep. She's up there for sure.
We're talking with reporters Lauren Camera and Michael Stratford about the presidential election and the candidates' education policy platforms. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. And thank you to everyone who has taken a moment to rate us on iTunes. Your support and feedback are helping us grow. Michael, I'd like to bring you back into the conversation now and look ahead for higher education. Before we jump into what a second Trump term might mean for post-secondary schools, what's been the president's impact thus far?
The president didn't really have much of a higher ed plan sketched out before he took office. And Betsy DeVos, as you talked about, has primarily been focused on, her main public attention has been largely on K-12 education. I think her largest accomplishments on higher ed have mostly been at the regulatory level. The policies that she's changed at the education department, regulations governing colleges and universities, college accreditors, related to federal student loans, and probably most significantly, this straddles both K-12 and higher ed, but her rewrite of Title IX regulations governing all types of sexual misconduct in education.
Can we argue that if people are going to be swayed by president's impact on education, that the fallout of the pandemic is going to be the top line here for higher education, just like K-12?
I think that's right. Higher education, like K-12 education, is in this unprecedented state of uncertainty, chaos, disruption, whatever words you want to use to describe what's happening right now. And that, I think, is what voters are connecting to, whether they're a local school or their campus is open or closed or virtual or not virtual. We've seen in higher education, the enrollment numbers for this fall are down from previous years because of the pandemic, overall down a few percentage points. But if you drill down a little more, the largest declines have been at places like community colleges, which I think is raising some concerns over who is being left out of higher education during the pandemic.
You mentioned rolling back Title IX guidance. Also, Secretary DeVos has been unpicking consumer protections for student borrowers, and she's been spending a fair amount of time in court defending those decisions. Can you talk a little bit about that?
That's right. So, following the collapse of large for profit colleges like Corinthian colleges and ITT Tech, the Obama administration, towards the end of their term, tried to put in place some new rules and policies governing when the federal government discharges students' loans because of the misconduct of their college, because their college misled them or otherwise defrauded them. So the department started getting this influx of claims from students seeking debt relief. And the Trump administration's management of it has been politically fraught, to say the least, and keeps running into obstacles in court. DeVos's efforts to rewrite the standards and make it more difficult for people to get loan forgiveness has been at one point blocked by a judge. She's since been able to implement her standards, but her processing of this backlog of claims has also run into problems in court. It seems like going forward, whether it's a Trump administration or a Biden administration, it's fair to say that this process of deciding who and when people get loan forgiveness will be overseen in some way by the judiciary. I think it depends on, the outcome of the election will determine where the education department comes down on how difficult or how easy to make it to discharge your loan. But I think the legal challenges will probably continue either way.
So, what exactly is Trump promising this time around for post-secondary education? We've heard some general statements of support and promises for things like HBCUs, but is there something specific you can point to?
So, one of the interesting things is that Trump has pointed to his signing a law that provided permanent mandatory funding for HBCUs. There's a relatively small stream of funding that goes from the education department to HBCUs and other types of minority serving institutions. It was a bipartisan bill that Trump signed. So he has touted his support for HBCUs, and it's accurate for him to point to that piece of legislation. In terms of higher ed broadly, I think the other things to look for in a potential second Trump term is, I guess, what you might call culture war issues. The Trump administration has made clear that they are interested in scrutinizing wealthy elite colleges and universities. Most recently has involved Education Secretary Betsy DeVos scrutinizing their ties to foreign governments and foreign sources of funding. The Education Department has opened an investigation into Princeton over its admission publicly that it has systemic racism on its campus. There are a lot of hot button free speech on college campus. The Education Department has sought to regulate that and go after colleges where they feel like free speech isn't being upheld. I think those sort of culture war issues would continue in a second Trump term.
One of the big unsolved policy problems of the past few years for higher education has arguably been DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program. I was a little surprised that it didn't get more real estate in the campaign. And I'm wondering, where does Trump stand on things right now? I've seen some interviews where he said that he would actually support it and others where he's opposed it.
I think the president has had multiple positions on what to do with DACA. I think, broadly speaking, colleges and universities have been at odds significantly with the Trump administration's immigration policies, whether that be trying to end DACA, tightening restrictions on student visas and other types of visas, and the administration's crackdown on student visas in general. For colleges and universities, that has been one of their top concerns with the Trump administration. And I think, obviously, a Biden administration would have a different approach.
Well, let's talk about the Biden campaign and what that administration might look like. It's very clear his wife, Jill Biden, a longtime community college professor, is a big influence on some of those proposals. Let's talk about what he's offering in terms of a community college plan.
So Biden is proposing sort of to start where the Obama administration left off on community college, which is proposing universal free community college. And that would require the federal government to send billions of dollars a year to states to make that happen. But he has proposed free community college for all students. And then at 4-year colleges and universities, he's proposed to make it tuition free for students who are coming from families earning under $125,000, which is also where the Democratic Party was 4 years ago in 2016. Interesting that he wasn't pulled further to the left during their primary, where candidates on the left, like Bernie Sanders, were calling for universal free tuition at public colleges and universities. But regardless, these are really ambitious proposals that he will have to spend some political capital on if he wants to get through Congress.
Also, looking at student loan debt forgiveness, does he go as far as candidate Elizabeth Warren was promising?
So Joe Biden has proposed to cancel significant swath of the outstanding student debt in this country. He's proposed a plan during the campaign that would eliminate some outstanding debt for students who went to public colleges and universities and HBCUs and who are currently earning under $125,000. He's since adopted another idea during the pandemic to provide across the board to everyone $10,000 off of their student loan. That doesn't go as far as what Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders were proposing during the primary. But Joe Biden has left open the door to enacting that student debt plan through executive action rather than going through Congress, which is something that Elizabeth Warren has been advocating for. And I think you'll see growing pressure from the left for Biden to enact via executive action his student debt plan, especially if he is facing, some headwinds in Congress in either a Democratic or Republican controlled Senate.
What has surprised you in Biden's higher ed education plan?
I think that shift on student loan relief and student loan cancellation has been surprising. Just a few years ago, that was seen as an extremely radical idea, even in the Democratic Party, that was sort of at the fringes. And it has very much come into the mainstream. It's a plan that Biden is touting on the campaign trail. I think Kamala Harris mentioned during the vice presidential debate, she touted his $10,000 student debt relief plan. I think how quickly that has caught on and become a mainstream issue has been pretty interesting to watch.
You also had an interesting story where you were looking at the vice presidential race and specifically what Mike Pence and Kamala Harris might mean for higher education. What do we know?
One thing that Kamala Harris mentioned in the debate was, and this is something she talks about as her record as a prosecutor, she helped bring down one of the nation's largest for-profit colleges, Corinthian colleges, during the Obama administration. She was the Attorney General of California at the time. And I think that is one thing we haven't talked about in terms of differences between a Biden administration and a second Trump term is the approach towards for-profit education. The Biden administration, I think, would probably go even further than the Obama administration did on for-profit colleges. There's growing pressure in the Democratic Party to get rid of federal subsidies at all for the sector. And so I think that would be something to watch in a Biden administration that I think Kamala Harris has sort of talked about publicly and touted on the national stage.
I want to bring Lauren back into the conversation for a moment. So, as you both know, a lot of our audience are other education journalists. And I'm wondering, Lauren, have you got a crossover story that you'd like to see reporters doing, something that brings together K-12 and higher ed?
Yes, I'm so eager to see more reporting on this, actually, how the pandemic has impacted access to higher education for low-income students. And we saw signs that this was happening beginning way back in April and May when there was a huge drop-off in the number of poor students filling out the FAFSA. That's the form for federal student aid. There's a whole lot more research now about this, and some of it is really disturbing. I think it's going to be a major story, and I'd encourage education reporters to keep tabs on that. And of course, the other half of that story is our low-income students staying enrolled in college right now.
That's a great story idea. Michael, what about you?
So I cover federal policy and what Congress is doing. And one of the big debates right now is what's going on with another coronavirus relief package. And that has some pretty significant implications for education. And I think one area that is ripe for more reporting is what colleges and universities and what K-12 schools need during the pandemic in terms of financial help from the federal government. It's sort of abstract in a lot of ways when Congress is talking about billions of dollars, and there's bipartisan agreement from both sides that there's a need for a huge infusion of resources into education, both at the K-12 and higher education level. But I'm curious to see more reporting on exactly what the needs are and how schools and colleges have spent the money they've gotten so far. And so that's, I think, an interesting story that can be easily localized.
Do you want to hear my crossover story?
Yeah.
All right, it's solid gold and it's just for the two of you, so you can take it and run with it. I want someone to figure out how many college students have to drop out because they don't have childcare.
That number is probably a lot larger than people think it is.
I think it is too. We know that most college students these days are not 18-year-olds, leaving mom and dad's for the first time, that a lot of them are in their 20s and have kids of their own. So I'm really interested to see the crossover effect of that.
I love that idea. Thanks.
Go for it, Lauren. Michael, Lauren grabbed it first. Sorry.
I'll look forward to reading it.
I'll raise it, Michael.
Lauren Camera covers education for U.S. News and World Report. Lauren, thank you for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
And Michael Stratford of Politico Pro, it was a pleasure to have you here too. Thanks for all the great information.
Good talking with you, Emily. Thanks.
And that wraps up another episode for us. If there's a story or reporters you want to know more about, drop us a line with radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 70 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, take care of yourselves, and thank you for listening.